Stalin encouraged the development of small business. Without private entrepreneurship, there will be a deficit. The planned economy fetters initiative. These and other myths are especially popular among those who do business themselves or plan to do so in the future. In this video, we'll try to break down the fears and misconceptions about the fate of small entrepreneurs under socialism, and also what position Stalin took on this issue. First, let's look at small business in general from a Marxist point of view. In addition to the two main classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, there are classes that occupy an intermediate position in capitalist society. One of them is the petty bourgeoisie, small owners who live primarily or exclusively by their own labor. The basis for the existence of the petty bourgeoisie is small-scale production, which is inevitably destroyed and replaced by large-scale capitalist production. With the development of capitalism, particularly of monopoly, the petty bourgeoisie, so often celebrated in the bourgeois media as the small business owner, is increasingly exploited by big capital. Significant numbers of them will lose their livelihood and class position, moving them down into the ranks of the proletarian working class. Due to their economic role, the social position of the petty bourgeois is ambivalent and contradictory. On the one hand, he is the owner, since he has the means of production under his command, and even if his property is insignificant, including only a working room with tools, it always constitutes the basis of production and the main source of subsistence for the petty bourgeoisie. Acting as an owner, the small entrepreneur envies the position and wealth of the big capitalists. He is under their influence and seeks to rise to that higher economic position. Among other things, small business is directly dependent on big capitalists in terms of purchase and sale, credit systems, cooperative organizations, and other associations supposedly designed to alleviate the attached position of the petty bourgeois, but in fact make them even more dependent on the power of capital. On the other hand, like a toiler exploited by the big capitalists, the petty bourgeois gravitates towards the role of the proletariat. The financial situation, hostility towards corporations and monopolies, and the desire for democracy bring the petty bourgeoisie closer to the mindset of the wage earners. While the upper strata of their position approaches the bourgeoisie, the lowest small owners can even live worse than skilled workers. However, no matter how bad the material situation may be, the petty bourgeoisie differs from the worker in that they have the means of production in their private ownership. Because of this, the petty bourgeoisie is the most unstable group of the population. The economic conditions of their life are reflected in their psychology. Small business owners are characterized by their individualism and fear of change. The economic situation forces him to adapt to the hardships of life. In the case of the failure of their enterprise, they are deprived of the means of production, reduced to selling their labor power and becoming a proletarian, or falling into such a mania that manifests itself in senseless actions of even murder or suicide. Due to political limitations and the narrowness of their interests, the small entrepreneur hesitates and easily succumbs to bourgeois propaganda. Lenin described it in this way: a petty bourgeois, driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism, is a social phenomenon which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, and its tendency to turn rapidly into submission, apathy, phantasms, and even a frenzied infatuation with one bourgeois fad or another, all this is common knowledge. These properties inevitably penetrate the ranks of the working class, making it easier for the capitalists to influence the mass of the petty bourgeoisie, and under the guise of protecting their business interests, ultimately enforce the power of big business. However, there are historic examples of the progressive activity of the petty bourgeoisie. Classics of Marxism-Leninism convey great significance to attracting the broad small-owning masses of the petty bourgeoisie, mainly the peasantry, to the side of the working class in its revolutionary struggle against the bourgeoisie. Vladimir Lenin proved in practice both the possibility and necessity of attracting the petty bourgeois masses to join the camp of the proletariat. The victory of the October Revolution became possible thanks to the alliance of workers and peasants, and thus confirmed the viability of this theory. The overwhelming majority of the population of the USSR in those years were the peasantry and the remaining strata of the petty bourgeoisie. Unlike the capitalists and landlords, the petty bourgeoisie could not be expropriated. All this led to the fact that the key task of the Soviet government at that time was to attract the petty bourgeoisie, and above all, the broad masses of the peasantry, to build socialism by organizing a large socialized economy with the help of artels. The artel is one of the forms of the socialist collective economy of the USSR. Artels are formed by the voluntar uniting citizens to create and run a collective economy based on the socialization of the means of production. The purpose of creating an artel is to guide small-scale individual farming down the path of a socialist economy, re-educate the small owner into a collectivist, and improve the material situation of one's fellow collective members. In order to strengthen the alliance of workers and peasants, to resolve the catastrophic situation in agriculture, and suppress the revival of capitalism in the countryside, the leadership of the USSR took decisive measures. Under the conditions of the NEP, the Soviet government organized all-around support for the poorest strata of the peasantry, the poor and middle peasants, along with the suppression of wealthy kulak owners. At the same time, a policy of investing peasants in the collective farms, the agricultural artels, was pursued. The agricultural artel in the USSR introduced the socialist economy to farming the land. This land was publicly owned and assigned to the collective farm for perpetual use, that is, forever, and was not subject to either purchase or sale or lease. Tractors, combine harvesters, and all other complex agricultural machines used on the collective farm belonged to state and tractor stations. All other basic means of production, such as public livestock, agricultural implements, seeds, fodder, or outbuildings, were collectively owned by all members of the artel. The products of collective farm production and the monetary funds were redistributed in accordance with the Charter of Agricultural Artels by the collective farmers themselves. Collective farms made it possible to transform agriculture on a socialist basis in a short time, providing the agricultural sector with modern technology and scientific personnel, turning individual peasants into collective farmers. In 1940, the USSR had 340,000 collective farms, employing more than 50 million people. In the future, agricultural artels were to become state enterprises of the agro-industrial complex, similar to state farms. State farms are a socialist type of large state agricultural enterprise. State farms were state factories of grain, meat, milk, wool, cotton, and other agricultural products, and served as a model for large-scale socialist agricultural production. Marxism-Leninism emphasizes the inevitable merging of collective property with public property in one form or another as we move towards communism. The emphasis is on ensuring that the process of socialization of collective farms should take place gradually, without causing any harm and without causing discontent among the working people. Stalin adhered to the same position. Today, there are two basic forms of socialist production in our country: state, or publicly owned production, and collective farm production, which cannot be said to be publicly owned. In the state enterprises, the means of production and the product of production are national property. In the collective farm, although the means of production, land, machines, do belong to the state, the product of production is the property of different collective farms. How the formation of a single and united sector will come about is a special question which requires separate discussion. In the field of small industry in the USSR, there were so-called commercial artels, in which, as a rule, worked between 10 and 200 people. 8 out of 10 of such enterprises fulfilled regular household needs: hairdressing salons, furniture workshops, the production of building materials, and other similar enterprises. At first glance, artels have a lot in common with modern small businesses. On the basis of this idea, exclamatory statements are made today claiming that there was private entrepreneurship under Stalin and in the USSR in general. But first, we must clarify that unlike a business, an artel cannot be bought, sold, inherited. All its movable and immovable property was in the equal collective ownership of the employees of the enterprise, the right of which to use was cancelled upon each departure or dismissal. Secondly, the main goal of production in the artel was not to make a profit, but to increase the welfare of the entire society. The exploitation of labor of hired workers in artels was strictly limited by law. Thirdly, any attempt to carry out private production under the guise of an artel was severely punished. From July 1948 to January 1949 alone, almost 9,000 artel and local industry enterprise workers were prosecuted for embezzlement, abuse, private entrepreneurial activity, and the organization of pseudo-artels. Most importantly, despite its independence at the grassroots level, the most important issues in the artels were only resolved through agreement with government agencies. The organization of trade councils and unions within the framework of a large country was built from the bottom up, from cities to the Union republics, subordinate to a single central council of trade cooperatives and council of ministers of the Union republics. Production rates, tariffs, and salaries were all set similarly to those at comparable state-owned enterprises. Unlike modern small enterprises, which operate under conditions of market competition, the activities of artels under socialism were carried out according to plans approved by higher cooperative organizations. In turn, the Industrial Cooperation Plan was part of a unified national economic plan of the USSR. In addition, the Communist Party exerted a great influence on the cooperative sector, not only directly through government agencies, but indirectly as well. Approximately every 1 in 10 cooperative workers was a communist, and among the delegates to cooperative congresses, this reached up to 90%. The cooperatives took all party decisions into account in their resolutions and responded to mass campaigns carried out by the party. Cooperatives regularly participated in socialist competition, both between other artels and with local state enterprises, which had a positive effect on the results of production of all types of industry. Several conclusions can be drawn here on the fate of small business under socialism. There is no question of any protection for the interests of freedom of entrepreneurship in a socialist society, especially under Stalin. Attempts to create private production under the guise of artels were suppressed. The years of Stalin's leadership were characterized by the strengthening of the role of the state in the activities of the artel, and the subsequent merging of them in the mid-1930s. The post-war years are no exception, when in relation to cooperation, some relaxation and decentralization were temporarily allowed. This was due to the pragmatic desire of the government to speed up the restoration of the country, and by and large, did not change the situation in any way. And with the victory of the collective farm system in the USSR, the main base of the petty bourgeoisie, private ownership of the means of production, disappeared. Millions of small proprietors and commodity-producing workers, each limited by their private basis, have been transformed into millions of collective farm workers, basing their wealth on socialist property and collective labor. Craftsmen and handicraftsmen, by joining in industrial cooperatives, became involved in the construction of socialist society. After the displacement of private trade by Soviet trade, the soil for the growth of merchants disappeared. Lastly, it can be said that the agricultural and commercial artels were part of a plan for the cooperation of the petty bourgeois masses. This plan had the aim of turning them into industrial workers of the future and integrating them into the working class of the USSR. Formation of the modern agro-industrial complex and the monopolization of agriculture under capitalism gives reason to believe that there will be no need for collective farms in the socialist state of the future. However, industrial cooperatives will remain, covering those sectors of the economy that cannot be immediately converted into public property. The history of socialist cooperation clearly dispels the myth that it's impossible to satisfy all the needs of people without small businesses. The fears of the petty bourgeoisie over the death of private initiative, of bureaucratic regulation and shortages under socialism are only speculations coming from the constant streams of capitalist propaganda that they consume, and historically particular mistakes from the socialist construction of the past. No one will be able to show initiative and realize their potential within the framework of production cooperatives without the fundamental threats characteristic of the capitalist economy in the form of monopolization, bankruptcy, competition, and the motivations of corporate takeover. Communists and the working class government ensure employment in a calm and secure environment within the framework of a greater economic plan and with the full support of the socialist state. Stay tuned.